Hello everyone, this is Andrew. Welcome to Keen on America.
On July 4th, 2026, America will be 250 years old. An anniversary that will, no doubt, be greeted with a mixture of celebration, contemplation, and resignation. In Keen on America, Andrew talks not just about the American past and present, but also speculates on its future. What, Andrew asks, will be the 21st century fate of this now venerable American republic?
Hello everybody. In these supposedly dark times, the E word comes up a lot, the Enlightenment. Are we at the end of the Enlightenment or the beginning? Was there even an Enlightenment? My guest today, David Bell, a professor of history, very distinguished professor of history at Princeton University, has an interesting piece in the spring issue of Liberties, one of our favorite quarterlies here on Keen on America. Here, Bell's piece is The Enlightenment Then and Now, and David is joining us from the home of the Enlightenment, perhaps, Paris in France, where he's on sabbatical. Hard life, David, being an academic these days, isn't it?
Very difficult. I'm having to suffer the Parisian bread and croissant. It's terrible.
Yeah, well, I won't keep you too long. Is Paris then, or France, is it the home of the Enlightenment? I know there are many Enlightenments, the French, the Scottish, maybe even the English, perhaps even the American.
It's certainly one of the homes of the Enlightenment, and it's probably the closest that the Enlightenment had to a center, absolutely. Uh, but as you say, there were Edinburgh, Glasgow, plenty of places in Germany, Philadelphia. All those places have good claims to being centers of the Enlightenment as well.
All the same, David, is it like one of those sports games in California where everyone gets a medal?
Well, they're different medals, right? But I think certainly Paris is where everybody went. I mean, if you look at the figures from the German Enlightenment, from the Scottish Enlightenment, from the American Enlightenment, they all tended to congregate in Paris, and the Parisians didn't tend to go anywhere else unless they were forced to. So that gives you a pretty good sense of where the most important center was.
So, David, before we get to specifics, map out for us, because not everyone is perhaps as familiar or comfortable with the history of the Enlightenment, and certainly as you are. When did it happen? What years? And who are the leaders of this thing called the Enlightenment?
Well, that's a big question. And I'm afraid, of course, that if you ask 10 historians, you'll get 10 different answers.
Well, I'm only asking you, so I only want one answer.
So I would say that the Enlightenment really gets going around the first couple of decades of the 18th century. And that's when people really start to think that they are actually living in what they start to call an enlightened century. There are a lot of reasons for this. They are seeing what we now call the scientific revolution. They're looking at the progress that has been made with that. They are experiencing the changes in the religious sphere, including the end of the religious wars, coming of a great deal of skepticism about religion. They are living in a relative period of peace, where they're able to speculate much more broadly and daringly than before. But it's really in those first couple of decades that they start thinking of themselves as living in an enlightened century, and they start defining themselves as something that would later be called the Enlightenment. So I would say that it's really there between about maybe the end of the 17th century and 1720s that it really gets going.
So let's have some names, David, of philosophers, I guess. I mean, if those are the right words. I know that there was a term in French, there is a term called philosophe. Were they the founders, the leaders of the Enlightenment?
Well, I don't want to descend into academic quibbling here, but there were lots of leaders. Let me give an example, though. So the year 1721 is a remarkable year. So in the year 1721, two amazing events happened within a couple of months of each other. So in May, Montesquieu, one of the great philosophers by any definition, publishes his novel called Persian Letters. And this is an incredible novel. It's still, I think, one of the greatest novels ever written, and it's very daring. It is the account. It is supposedly an account written by two Persian travelers to Europe who are writing back to people in Isfahan about what they're seeing, and it is very critical of French society. It is very critical of religion. It is, as I said, very, very daring philosophically. It is a product in part of the increasing contact between Europe and the rest of the world that is also very central to the Enlightenment. So that novel comes out. It's immediately, the police try to suppress it, but they don't have much success because it's incredibly popular. And Montesquieu doesn't suffer any particular problems because
And the French police have never been the most efficient police force in the world, have they?
oh, they could be, but not in this case. And then 2 months later, after Montesquieu publishes this novel, there's a German philosopher, much less well known than Montesquieu, named Christian Wolff, who is a professor at the University of Halle in Prussia. And he gives an oration in Latin, a very typical university oration for the time, about Chinese philosophy, in which he says that the Chinese have sort of proved to the world, particularly through the writings of Confucius and others, that you can have a virtuous society without religion. Obviously, a very controversial statement for the time. It actually gets him fired from his job. He has to leave the Kingdom of Prussia within 48 hours on penalty of death. Starts an enormous controversy. But here are two events, both of which involving non-European people, sort of, involving the way in which Europeans are starting to look out at the rest of the world and starting to imagine Europe as just one part of a larger humanity. And at the same time, they are starting to speculate very daringly about, whether you can have, what it means to have a society. Do you need to have religion in order to have morality in society? Do you need to have what kind of government do you need to have virtuous conduct and a proper society? So all of these things get, really crystallized, I think, around these two incidents as much as anything. So if I had to pick a single date for when the Enlightenment starts, I'd probably pick that 1721.
And when was David? I thought you were going to tell me about the earthquake in Lisbon. When was that earthquake?
Oh, that earthquake comes quite a bit later. That comes, and now historians should be better with dates than I am. It's in the 1750s. I think it's the late 1750s. Again, this historian is getting a very bad grade for forgetting the exact date, but it's in the 1750s. So that's a different kind of event, which sparks off a great deal of commentary, because it's a terrible earthquake. It destroys most of the city of Lisbon. It destroys other cities throughout Portugal, and it leads a lot of the philosophers of the time to be speculating very daringly again on whether there is any kind of real purpose to the universe and whether there's any kind of divine purpose. Why would such a terrible thing happen? Why would God do such a thing to his followers? And certainly Voltaire.
Yeah,
Writes
Voltaire, of course, comes
Candide,
to mind of questioning.
and Candide, Voltaire's novel Candide, gives a very good description of the earthquake in Lisbon and uses that as a centerpiece. Voltaire also read other things about the earthquake, a poem about the Lisbon earthquake. But in Candide, he gives a lasting, very scathing portrait of the Catholic Church in general, and then of what happens in Portugal. And so the Lisbon earthquake is certainly another one of the events, but it happens considerably later, really in the middle of the Enlightenment by any
So,
means.
David, you believe in this idea of the Enlightenment. I take your point that there are more than one Enlightenment and more than one center, but in broad historical terms, the 18th century could be defined, at least in Western and Northern Europe, as the period of the Enlightenment. Would that be a fair generalization?
I think it's a perfectly fair generalization. Of course, there are historians who say that it never happened. There's a conservative British historian, J.C.D. Clarke, who published a book last summer saying that the Enlightenment is a kind of myth, that there was a lot of intellectual activity in Europe, obviously, but that the idea that it formed a coherent Enlightenment was really invented in the 20th century by a bunch of progressive reformers who wanted to claim a kind of, venerable and august pedigree for their own liberal reform plans. I think that's an exaggeration. People in the 18th century defined very clearly what was going on, both people who were in favor of it and people who were against it. And if you look very closely at it, of course, it gets a bit fuzzy. Of course, it gets, there's no single, you can't define a single Enlightenment project or a single Enlightenment, ideology. But then, I think people would be hard pressed to define any intellectual movement, in perfectly coherent terms. So the Enlightenment is, by compared with almost any other intellectual movement, certainly existed.
In terms of a philosophy of the Enlightenment, um, the German thinker Immanuel Kant seems to be often, I don't know whether you describe him as the conscience or the brain or a mixture of the conscience and brain of the Enlightenment. Why is Kant and Kantian thinking so important in the development of the Enlightenment?
Well, that's a really interesting question. And one reason is because most of the Enlightenment was not very rigorously philosophical. The A lot of the major figures of the Enlightenment before Kant tended to be writing for a general public, and they often were writing with a very specific agenda. You look at Voltaire, Diderot, Rousseau. You look at Adam Smith in Scotland. You look at David Hume or Adam Ferguson. You look at Benjamin Franklin in the United States. These people wrote in all sorts of different genres. They wrote all sorts of different kinds of books. They had many different purposes, and very few of them did a lot of what we would call rigorous academic philosophy. And Kant was different. Kant was very much an academic philosopher. Kant was nothing if not rigorous. He came at the end of the Enlightenment by most people's measure, and he wrote these very, very difficult, very rigorous, very brilliant works, such as the Critique of Pure Reason. And so it's certainly been the case that people who have wanted to describe the Enlightenment as a philosophy have tended to look to Kant. So, for example, there's a great German philosopher and intellectual historian of the early 20th century named Ernst Cassirer, who had to leave Germany because of the Nazis. And he wrote a great book called The Philosophy of the Enlightenment. And that leads directly to Immanuel Kant. And of course, Cassirer himself was a Kantian, identified with Kant. And so he wanted to make Kant, in a sense, the telos, the endpoint, the culmination, the fulfillment of the Enlightenment. So I think that's why Kant has such a particularly important position. You're defining it.
I've always struggled to understand what Kant was trying to say. I'm certainly not alone there. Might it be fair to say that he was trying to transform the universe and certainly traditional Christian notions into the Enlightenment? So the entire universe, the world, God, whatever that means, that they were all somehow, according to Kant, enlightened.
Well, I think that I'm certainly no expert on Immanuel Kant, and I would say that he is trying to. I mean, his major philosophical works are trying to put together a system of philosophical thinking which will justify why people have to act morally, why people have to act rationally, without the need for Christian revelation to bolster that. That's a very, very, very crude and reductionist way of putting it, but that's essentially at the heart of it. At the same time, Kant was very much aware of his own place in history. So Kant didn't simply write these very difficult, thick, dense philosophical works. He also wrote, things that were more like journalism or like pamphlets. He wrote a famous essay called "What is Enlightenment?" And in that, he said that the 18th century was the period in which humankind was simply beginning to reach a period of enlightenment. And he said he starts the essay by saying, this is the period when humankind is being released from its self-imposed tutelage. And we are still, and he said, we do not yet live in the midst of a completely enlightened century, but we are getting there. We are living in a century that is enlightening.
So the seeds of Hegel and maybe even Marx are in Kant, in that German thinking, that historical.
In some ways, of course, Hegel very much reacts against Kant, and then Marx reacts against Hegel. So it's not.
Well, that's the dialectic, isn't it, David?
A simple, easy path from one to the other. No, but Hegel is unimaginable without Kant, of course, and Marx is unimaginable without Hegel.
You note that Kant represents a shift in some ways into the university, and the walls of the universities were going up, and that some of the other figures associated with the Enlightenment, Scottish Enlightenment, Hume and Smith and the French Enlightenment, Voltaire and the others. They were more generalist writers. Should we be nostalgic for the pre-university period in the Enlightenment, or did things start getting serious once the heavyweights, the academic heavyweights like Immanuel Kant got into this thing?
I think it depends on where we're talking about. I mean, Adam Smith was a professor at Glasgow and Edinburgh. So Smith, the Scottish Enlightenment was definitely at least partly in the universities. The German Enlightenment took place very heavily in universities. Christian Wolff, who I just mentioned, was the most important German philosopher of the 18th century before Kant, and he had his positions in university. Even the French university system, for a while, what's interesting about the French university system, particularly the Sorbonne, which was the theology faculty, was that throughout the first half of the 18th century, there were very vigorous, very interesting philosophical debates going on there, in which the people there, particularly even Jesuits there, were very open to a lot of the ideas we now call Enlightenment. They were reading John Locke, they were reading Malebranche, they were reading Descartes. What happened, though, in the French universities was that as more daring stuff was getting published elsewhere, the church, the Catholic Church, started to say, "All right, these philosophers, these philosophes, these are our enemies. These are people we have to get at." And so at that point, anybody who was in the university who was still in dialogue with these people was basically purged, and the universities became much less interesting after that. But to come back to your question, I do think that I am very nostalgic for that period. I think that the Enlightenment was an extraordinary period because if you look between in the 17th century, not all, but a great deal of the most interesting intellectual work is happening in the so-called Republic of Letters. It's happening in the Latin language. It is happening in a very small circle of erudits, of scholars. By the 19th century, following Kant and Hegel, and then the birth of the research university in Germany, which is copied everywhere, philosophy and the most advanced thinking goes back into the university. And the 18th century, particularly in France, I will say, is a time when the most advanced thought is being written for a general public. It is being written in the form of novels, of dialogues, of stories, of reference works, and it is very, very accessible. The most profound thought of the West has never been as accessible overall as in the 18th century.
Again, excuse this question, it might seem a bit naive, but there's a lot of pre-Enlightenment work, books, thinking that we read now that's very accessible, from Erasmus and Thomas More to Machiavelli. Why weren't characters like, or are characters like Erasmus, More's Utopia, Machiavelli's Prince and Discourses, why aren't they considered part of the Enlightenment? What's the difference between the enlightened thinkers, or the supposedly enlightened thinkers of the 18th century, and thinkers and writers of the 16th and 17th centuries?
It's a good question. I think you have to, again, one has to draw a line somewhere. That's not a very good answer, of course. All these people that you just mentioned are in one way or another predecessors to the Enlightenment. And of course, there were lots of people. I don't mean to say that nobody wrote in an accessible way before 1700. Obviously, lots of the people you mentioned did. Although, a lot of them originally wrote in Latin, Erasmus, also Thomas More. But I think what makes the Enlightenment different is that you have, again, you have a sense, these people have a sense that they are themselves engaged in a collective project, that it is a collective project of enlightenment, of enlightening the world. They believe that they live in a century of progress, and there are certain principles. They don't agree on everything by any means. The philosophy of the Enlightenment like nothing more than ripping each other to shreds, like any decent group of intellectuals. But that said, they generally did believe that people needed to have freedom of speech. They believed that you needed to have toleration of different religions. They believed in education and the need for a broadly educated public that could be as broad as possible. They generally believed in keeping religion out of the public sphere as much as possible. So all those principles came together into a program that we can consider at least a kind of not that everybody agreed on it at every moment by any means, but there is an identifiable enlightenment program there in any case, and an identifiable enlightenment mindset. One other thing I think which is crucial to the Enlightenment is that they was the attention they started to pay to something that we now take almost entirely for granted, which is the idea of society. The word society is so entirely ubiquitous, we assume it's always been there. And in one sense, it has, because the word societas is a Latin word. But until the 18th century, the word society generally had a much narrower meaning. It referred to, particular institution most often, like when we talk about the society of, the American Philosophical Society or something like that. And the idea that there exists something called society, which is a general sphere of human existence that is separate from religion and is separate from the political sphere, that's actually something which only really emerged at the end of the 1600s. And it became really the focus of, much, if not most, of Enlightenment thinking. When you look at someone like Montesquieu, when you look at somebody like Rousseau or Voltaire or Adam Smith, probably above all, they were concerned with understanding how society works, not how government works only, but how society works, what social interactions are like, the beginning of what we would now call social science. So that's yet another thing that distinguishes the Enlightenment from people like Machiavelli, from people like Thomas More, from people like Moses.
You noted earlier that the idea of progress is somehow baked in part, in certainly when it comes to Kant, certainly the French Enlightenment, although, of course, Rousseau challenged that. I'm not sure whether Rousseau, as always, is both in and out of the Enlightenment, and he seems to be in and out of everything. How did the Enlightenment, though, make sense of itself in the context of antiquity, as it was, of course, again, speaking in these broad historical terms, it was the Renaissance that supposedly discovered or rediscovered antiquity. How did many of the leading Enlightenment thinkers, writers, how did they think of their own society in the context of not just antiquity, but even the idea of a European or Western society?
Well, there's a great book. One of the great histories of the Enlightenment was written about more than 50 years ago by Yale professor named Peter Gay. And the first part of that book was called The Modern Paganism. So it was about it was very much about the relationship between the Enlightenment and the ancient Greeks and Romans. And certainly the writers of the Enlightenment felt a great deal of kinship with the ancient Greeks and Romans. They felt a common bond, particularly in opposing Christianity and opposing what they believed the Christian church had wrought on Europe in suppressing freedom and suppressing free thought and suppressing free inquiry. And so they felt that they were both recovering, but also going beyond antiquity at the same time. And of course, they were all, everybody at the time, every single major figure of the Enlightenment, their education consisted in large part of what we would now call classics, right? There was an educational reformer in France in the 1760s who said, our educational system is great if the purpose is to train Roman centurions. If it's to train modern people, we're not doing quite so well. And it's true. They would spend certainly, in Germany and in much of Europe, Netherlands, even in France. People were trained not simply to read Latin, but to write in Latin. In Germany, university courses took part in Latin, in the Latin language. So there's an enormous, so they're certainly very, very conversant with the Greek and Roman classics, and they identify with them to a very great extent. Someone like Rousseau, and many others. What's his first reading? He learns to read by reading Plutarch, in translation, but he learns to read by reading Plutarch. He is seized from the beginning by this enormous admiration for the ancients that he gets from Plutarch.
But was Socrates relevant here? Was the Enlightenment somehow replacing Aristotle with Socrates and making him and his spirit of enlightenment, of asking questions rather than answering questions, the symbol of a new way of thinking?
I would say to a certain extent. Much of the Enlightenment criticizes scholasticism, medieval scholasticism, very sharply, and medieval scholasticism is founded philosophically very heavily upon Aristotle. So to that extent, yes. And the spirit of skepticism that Socrates embodied the idea of taking nothing for granted, of asking questions about everything, including questions of oneself. Yes, absolutely. Uh, that said, while the great figures of the Enlightenment read Plato and knew Plato, uh, he was not, Socrates was generally not. I mean, was not all that present as a kind of icon. But certainly, people read Plato and were inspired by it.
You mentioned Benjamin Franklin earlier, David. Most of the Enlightenment, of course, seems to be centered in France and Scotland, Germany, England. But America, many Europeans went to America then as what some people would call a settler colonial society, or certainly an offshoot of the European world. Was the uh, was the settling of America and the American Revolution, was it the quintessential Enlightenment project?
Um, Another very good question, and again, it depends a bit on whom you talk to. I just mentioned this book by Peter Gay, and the last part of his book is called The Science of Freedom, and it's all about the American Revolution. So for certainly a lot of interpreters of the Enlightenment have said that, yes, the American Revolution represents, in a sense, the best possible outcome of the American Revolution represents the best possible outcome of the Enlightenment. And certainly you look at the founding fathers of the United States, and there's a great deal that they took from the Enlightenment. Certainly they took a great number of political ideas from it. Obviously, Madison was very much inspired in drafting articles of the Constitution by Montesquieu, as he himself was happy to admit. In addition, most of the founding fathers of the United States had kind of, we were still definitely Christians, but we're also very much influenced by deism. We're very much against the idea of making the United States a kind of confessional country where Christianity was dominant. They believed in the Enlightenment principles of free speech, religious toleration, and so on and so forth. So, in all those senses, and very very much the founding fathers were inspired. And Franklin was somebody who was very conversant with the European Enlightenment. He spent a large part of his life in London, where he was in contact with figures of the Enlightenment. He also, during the American Revolution, of course, he was mostly in France, where he was feted by some of the surviving philosophes, and was very much in contact with them as well. So yes, I would say the American Revolution certainly, and then the American Revolution is seen, of course, by the Europeans very much as a kind of offshoot of the Enlightenment. So one of the great late books of the late Enlightenment is by Condorcet, which he wrote while he was in hiding, actually, from the French Revolutionary Terror. It's called a historical sketch of the progress of the human spirit, or the human mind. And he writes about the American Revolution as being basically owing its existence to the Enlightenment.
Franklin is, of course, an example of your pre-academic Enlightenment, a generalist, inventor, scientist, entrepreneur, political thinker. What about the role of science and indeed economics in the Enlightenment, David? We're going to talk, of course, about the Marxist interpretation, perhaps the vulgar Marxist interpretation, which sees the Enlightenment as just a euphemism, perhaps, for exploitative capitalism. How central was the growth and development of the market, of economics and innovation and capitalism in your reading of the Enlightenment?
Well, in my reading, it was very important, but not in the way that the Marxists used to say. So Friedrich Engels once said that the Enlightenment was basically the idealized kingdom of the bourgeoisie. And there was a whole strain of Marxist thinking that followed the assumption that, and then Karl Marx himself argued that the documents like the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen, which obviously were inspired by the Enlightenment, were simply kind of veneer or kind of way that the bourgeoisie was able to advance itself ideologically. And I don't think that holds much water. There's very little indication that any particular economic class motivated the Enlightenment or was using the Enlightenment in any way. That said, I think it's very difficult to imagine the Enlightenment without the social and economic changes that come in with the 18th century. To begin with globalization. If you read the great works of the Enlightenment, it's remarkable just how open they are to talking about humanity in general. So one of Voltaire's largest works, one of his most important works, is something called Essay on Customs and on the Spirit of Nations, which is actually a history of the world, where he talks learnedly not simply about Europe, but about the Americas, about China, about Africa, about India. Uh, Montesquieu writes Persian letters. Christian Wolff writes about Chinese philosophy. Rousseau writes about the earliest days of humankind, talks about Africa. All the great figures of the Enlightenment are writing about the rest of the world, and this is a period in which contacts between Europe and the rest of the world are exploding, along with international trade. So by the end of the 18th century, there are 4,000 to 5,000 ships a year crossing the Atlantic. It's an enormous number, and and that's one context in which the Enlightenment takes place. Another is what we call the consumer revolution. So in the 18th century, certainly in the major cities of Western Europe, people of a wide range of social classes, including even artisans, wealthy, sort of somewhat wealthy artisans, shopkeepers, are suddenly able to buy a much larger range of products than ever before. They're able to choose how to basically furnish their own lives, if you will, how they're going to dress, what they're going to eat, what they're going to put on the walls of their apartments, and so on and so forth. And so they become accustomed to exercising a great deal more sort of personal choice than their ancestors had done. And the Enlightenment, really develops in tandem with this. Most of the great works of the Enlightenment, they're not really written to, they're not treatises, they're not like Kant, they're not written to sort of persuade you to think in a single way. They're really written to make you ask questions yourself, to force you to ponder things. They're written in the form of puzzles, of riddles. Voltaire had a great line there. He wrote that the best kind of books are the books that readers write half of themselves as they read. And that's sort of the quintessence of the Enlightenment, as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah, Voltaire might have been comfortable on YouTube or Facebook. David, you mentioned all those ships going from Europe across the Atlantic. Of course, many of those ships were filled with African slaves. You mentioned this in your piece. I mean, this
Yeah.
is no secret, of course. You also mentioned a couple of times Montesquieu's Persian letters. To what extent is the Enlightenment then perhaps the birth of Western power, of Western colonialism, of going to Africa, seizing people, selling them in North America, the French, the English, Dutch colonization of the rest of the world? Of course, later, more sophisticated Marxist thinkers from the Frankfurt School, you mentioned these in your essay, Adorno and Horkheimer in particular, see the Enlightenment as a project, if you like, of Western domination. I remember reading many years ago when I was in graduate school, Edward Said, his analysis of books like the Persian Letters, which is a form of cultural Western power. How much of this is simply bound up in the profound, perhaps, injustice of the Western achievement, and of course, some of the justice as well? We haven't talked about Jefferson, but perhaps in Jefferson's life and his thinking and his enlightened principles and his life as a slave owner, these contradictions are most self-evident.
Well, there are certainly contradictions, and there's certainly, I think what's remarkable, if you think about it, is that if you read through works of the Enlightenment, you would be hard-pressed to find a justification for slavery. You do find a lot of critiques of slavery, and I think that's something very important to keep in mind. Obviously, the chattel slavery of Africans in the Americas began well before the Enlightenment. It began in 1500s. The Enlightenment doesn't have the credit for being the first movement to oppose slavery. That really goes back to various religious groups, especially the Quakers. But that said, you have in France, you have in Britain, in America even, you have a lot of figures associated with the Enlightenment who are critics, who are becoming very forceful opponents of slavery very early. Now, when it comes to imperialism, that's a tricky issue. What I think you find in the Enlightenment is you find different sorts of tendencies and different sorts of writings. So there are certainly a lot of writers of the Enlightenment who were deeply opposed to European imperialism. One of the most popular works of the late Enlightenment was a collective work edited by a man named the Abbé Raynal, which is called The History of the Two Indies. And that is a book which is deeply, deeply critical of European imperialism. At the same time, the Enlightenment, a lot of the works of history written during the Enlightenment tended, such as Voltaire's essay on customs, which I just mentioned, tend to give a kind of very linear version of history. They suggest that all societies follow the same path, from sort of primitive savagery, hunter-gatherers, through early agriculture, feudal stages, and on into sort of modern commercial society and civilization. And so they're basically saying, okay, we the Europeans are the most advanced. People like the Africans and the Native Americans are the least advanced. And so perhaps we're justified in going and, quote, bringing our civilization to them, what later generations would call the civilizing mission, or possibly just going over and exploiting them because we are stronger and we are more, and again, we are more advanced. So there, and then there's another thing that the Enlightenment that the Enlightenment did. The Enlightenment tended to destroy an older Christian view of humankind, which in some ways militated against modern racism. Christians believed, of course, that everyone was descended from Adam and Eve, which meant that there was an essential similarity among all humans. And the Enlightenment challenged this by challenging the biblical account of creation. The Enlightenment challenged this. Voltaire, for instance, believed that there had actually been several different human species that had different origins, and that can very easily become a justification for racism. Buffon, one of the most important figures of the French Enlightenment, one of the early naturalists, was crucial for trying to show that, in fact, nature is not static, that nature is always changing, that species are changing, including human beings. And so, again, that allowed people to think in terms of human beings different at different stages of what we now call evolution. And perhaps this would be a justification for privileging the more advanced humans over the less advanced humans. I think in the 18th century itself, most of these things remain potential rather than really being acted upon. But in the 19th century, figures of writers who would draw upon these things certainly went much further, and these became justifications for slavery, for imperialism, and other things. So again, the Enlightenment is the source of a great deal of stuff here, and you can't simply put it into one box or another.
You mentioned earlier, David, that Concordat wrote one of the later classics of
Condorcet.
Condorcet, excuse my French. Condorcet wrote one of the later classics of the Enlightenment when he was hiding from the French Revolution. In your mind, was the revolution itself the natural conclusion, climax, perhaps anticlimax of the Enlightenment? Certainly, it seems as if a lot of the critiques of the French Revolution, particularly the more conservative ones, Burke comes to mind, suggested that perhaps the principles of the Enlightenment inevitably led to the guillotine, or is that an unfair way of thinking of it?
Well, there are a lot of people who have thought like that. I mean, Edmund Burke, already writing in 1790, in his reflections on the revolution in France, he said, that everything which was great in the old regime is being dissolved, and dissolved by this new conquering empire of light and reason. And then he said about the French that in the groves of their academy, at the end of every vista, you see nothing but the gallows, nothing but the gallows. So there in 1790, he already seemed to be predicting the reign of terror and blaming it to a certain extent on the Enlightenment. That said, I think, again, the French Revolution is an incredibly complicated event. I mean, you certainly have, an explosion of what we could call Enlightenment thinking all over the place. In France, it happened in France. What happened there was that you had the collapse of an extraordinarily inefficient government and a very antiquated, paralyzed system of government that collapsed, created a kind of political vacuum. And into that vacuum stepped a lot of figures who were definitely readers of the Enlightenment. But again, the Enlightenment had, I said, I don't think you can call the Enlightenment a single thing. So to say that the Enlightenment inspired the French Revolution, let alone the terror.
Although your essay on liberties is the Enlightenment then and now, you probably didn't write. There's always these lazy editors who come up with inaccurate titles. So for you, there is no such thing as the Enlightenment.
No, there is, but it's a complex thing. It contains multitudes, just the way. So
it's the Enlightenments rather than the Enlightenment.
It has conflicting tendencies. It has contradictions within it. There's enough unity to refer to it as a singular noun, but it doesn't mean that it all went in one single direction.
But in historical terms, did the failure of the French Revolution, its descent into Robespierre and then Bonaparte, did it mark the end in historical terms, a kind of bookend of history? You began in 1720. By 1820, was the age of the Enlightenment pretty much over?
I would say yes. I think that again, once people, one of the things about the French Revolution is that people who are reading these books and they're reading these ideas and they're discussing things really start to act on them in a very different way from what had been done before. Before the French Revolution, you have a lot of absolute monarchs who are trying to bring certain Enlightenment principles to bear in their form of government, but they're not. Um, but it's difficult to sort of talk about, about a full-fledged attempt to enact kind of Enlightenment program. Certainly, a lot of the people in the French Revolution saw themselves as doing that, but as they did it, they ran into reality. I would say. I mean, now Tocqueville, when he writes his Old Regime and the Revolution, talks about how the French philosophes were full of these abstract ideas that were divorced from reality. And while that's an exaggeration, there was a certain truth to them. And as soon as you start having the age of revolutions, as soon as you start having people having to devise systems of government that will actually last, and as you have people, uh, democratic representative systems that will last, and as they start revising these systems under the pressure of actual events, then you're not simply talking about an intellectual movement anymore. You're talking about something very different. And so I would say that, well, obviously the ideas of the Enlightenment continue to inspire people. Books continue to be read, debated. They lead on to figures like Kant, and as we talked about earlier, Kant leads to Hegel. Hegel leads to Marx in a certain sense. Nonetheless, by the time you're getting into the 19th century, what you have, has connections to the Enlightenment, but can we really still call it the Enlightenment? I would say that.
And Tocqueville, of course, found democracy in America. Is democracy itself, I know it's a big question, but is it uh, bound up in the Enlightenment? You've written extensively, David, both for Liberties and elsewhere on liberalism. Is the promise of democracy, democratic systems, the one born in the American Revolution, promised in the French Revolution, not realized? Are they products of the Enlightenment, or is the 19th century and the democratic systems that evolved in the 19th century, is that just a separate historical track?
Again, I would say there are certain things in the Enlightenment that do lead in that direction. Certainly, I think most figures in the Enlightenment, in one general sense or another, accepted the idea of a kind of general notion of popular sovereignty. It didn't mean that they always felt that this was going to be something that could necessarily be acted upon or implemented in their own day. And they didn't necessarily associate, kind of generalized popular sovereignty with what we would now call democracy, with people being able to actually govern themselves. Um, there would be certain figures, certainly Diderot in some of his essays, but Rousseau very much in the social contract, were sketching out, models for a possible democratic system. Condorcet, who actually lived into the French Revolution, wrote one of the most draft constitution for France. That's one of the most democratic documents ever proposed. But of course, there were lots of figures in the Enlightenment, Voltaire, and others who actually believed much more in absolute monarchy, who believed that you should have freedom of speech and freedom of discussion, out of which the best ideas would emerge. But then you had to give those ideas to a prince who would impose them by force if necessary.
And of course, Rousseau himself, his social contract, some historians have seen that as the foundations of modern totalitarianism. Finally, David, your wonderful essay in Liberties in the Spring Quarterly 2025 is The Enlightenment Then and Now. What about now? You work at Princeton. Your president has very bravely stood up to the new presidential regime in the United States in defense of academic intellectual freedom. Does the word and the movement, does it have any relevance in the 2020s, particularly in an age of neo-authoritarianism around the world?
I think it does. I think we have to be careful about it. I always get a little nervous when people say, well, we should simply go back to the Enlightenment, because I mean the Enlightenment is history. You don't go back to the 18th century. I think what we need to do is to recover certain principles, certain ideals from the 18th century, the ones that matter to us, the ones that we think are right, and make our own enlightenment out of them. I don't think we have to, be governed by the 18th century. I mean, Thomas Paine once said that no generation should necessarily rule over every generation to come, and I think that's probably right. Unfortunately, in the United States, we have a constitution which is now essentially unamendable. So we're doomed to live by a constitution largely from the 18th century. But are there many things in the Enlightenment that we should look back to? Absolutely.
Well, David, I am going to free you for your own French Enlightenment. You can go and have some croissant now in your local cafe in Paris. Thank you so much for a very, excuse the pun, enlightening conversation on the Enlightenment, then and now, essential essay and liberties. I'd love to get you back on the show, talk more history. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you.